The cameras were rolling, the audience was cheering, and then 19-year-old Quinn River stood at the Family Feud podium with the carefully controlled expression of someone who had learned to navigate the world through a thick emotional fog, their face showing the subtle flatness that comes from living on medications that had successfully prevented them from wanting to die, but had also stripped away their ability to feel joy, excitement, love, or any of the emotional colors that make life feel worth living, rather than simply survivable. When Steve Harvey asked about the most difficult choice you've ever had to make, Quinn's response, delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing a medical procedure rather than a fundamental question about the nature of human experience, would reveal the cruel paradox of psychiatric treatment that can save lives while fundamentally altering what it means to be alive. Whether to feel suicidal or feel nothing at all, Quinn had said, their words carrying the weight of 2 years spent living in the strange liminal space between depression that had nearly killed them and medication-induced emotional numbness that had kept them breathing while making them question whether the person taking those breaths was still recognizably themselves. My antidepressants work. I'm not suicidal anymore, but they've also taken away every other feeling I used to have. I don't feel happy, sad, excited, or afraid. I'm just... The studio had fallen into an uncomfortable silence as everyone present tried to understand what it would mean to face such an impossible choice between the active pain of mental illness and the passive emptiness of emotional numbness, between feeling too much and feeling nothing at all, between the risk of self-destruction and the certainty of self-alienation. Quinn River had been battling severe depression since age 16, when what had initially seemed like typical teenage moodiness had evolved into a debilitating mental health crisis that had included multiple suicide attempts, psychiatric hospitalizations, and a period when their survival had depended entirely on intensive medical intervention and round-the-clock supervision by mental health professionals and family members. The depression that had nearly claimed Quinn's life had been characterized by overwhelming hopelessness, persistent suicidal ideation, complete loss of interest in activities that had once brought pleasure, and a level of emotional pain that had felt literally unbearable. During the worst periods, Quinn had been unable to function normally, had missed significant amounts of school, had withdrawn from all social relationships, and had required constant monitoring to prevent self-harm. The psychiatric medications that had finally stabilized Quinn's mood and eliminated their suicidal thoughts had been in many ways life-saving interventions that had allowed them to return to school, rebuild relationships with family and friends, and begin planning for a future that had previously seemed impossible. But these same medications had also created a profound emotional flattening that had left Quinn feeling disconnected from their own experience and uncertain about their identity and authentic self. The condition known as medication-induced emotional blunting or emotional numbness is a common but often under-recognized side effect of many psychiatric medications, particularly antidepressants and mood stabilizers. While these medications can be highly effective at reducing symptoms of depression and preventing dangerous mood episodes, they can also diminish the full range of human emotional experience, leaving patients feeling emotionally muted or dampened. For Quinn, the emotional blunting had been gradual but comprehensive, affecting not just their ability to feel sadness or despair, but also their capacity for joy, love, excitement, creativity, and all the subtle emotional nuances that had previously made their life feel rich and meaningful. They described feeling like they were watching their life happen from behind glass, able to understand intellectually that certain experiences should be meaningful or enjoyable, but unable to access the emotional responses that would make those experiences feel personally significant. The impact on Quinn's relationships had been complex and sometimes painful. While their family and friends were grateful that Quinn was no longer suicidal and was able to function normally, many had also noticed and mourned the loss of Quinn's emotional expressiveness, spontaneity, and the passionate engagement with life that had characterized their personality before depression and medication had altered their emotional landscape. Quinn's romantic relationships had been particularly affected by their emotional numbness. While they could intellectually understand that they cared about partners and could engage in the behaviors associated with love and affection, they struggled to access the deeper emotional connections and feelings of attachment that typically characterize intimate relationships. This had created a sense of going through the motions of connection without experiencing the internal rewards that make relationships feel meaningful. The creative and intellectual pursuits that had once been sources of joy and self-expression for Quinn had also been affected by their emotional flattening. Activities like writing, music, and art that had previously felt emotionally engaging and personally meaningful now felt mechanical and empty, as if Quinn was executing the technical aspects of creativity without accessing the emotional inspiration that had once driven their artistic expression. The dilemma that Quinn faced was made more complex by the fact that previous attempts to reduce or discontinue their psychiatric medications had consistently led to the return of severe depressive symptoms and suicidal ideation. This had created a situation where Quinn felt trapped between two unsatisfactory states of being: the acute suffering of untreated depression or the chronic emptiness of medicated emotional numbness. Quinn had worked extensively with psychiatrists and therapists to find alternative medications or treatment approaches that might preserve mood stability while restoring emotional range, but this process had been slow, complicated, and often frustrating. Some medication adjustments had led to breakthrough depression, while others had created different side effects or had been ineffective at maintaining the mood stability that kept Quinn safe. The philosophical and existential questions raised by Quinn's situation had been profound and troubling for them and their family. Was it better to feel intense emotional pain if it was accompanied by the full range of human emotion, or was it preferable to feel nothing if it meant avoiding the risk of self-destruction? What did it mean to be authentically yourself when your emotional responses were chemically altered? How could you make meaningful life decisions when you couldn't access your emotional reactions to help guide your choices? Quinn's family had struggled with their own complex feelings about their loved one's medication-induced emotional changes. While they were profoundly grateful that Quinn was alive and stable, they also grieved for the loss of Quinn's emotional vibrancy and worried about the long-term implications of living without access to the full spectrum of human feeling. The stigma and misunderstanding surrounding medication-induced emotional blunting had added another layer of difficulty to Quinn's experience. Well-meaning people often suggested that feeling nothing was preferable to feeling depressed, not understanding that emotional numbness created its own form of suffering and existential crisis. Others implied that Quinn should be grateful for their psychiatric stability without recognizing the significant costs and trade-offs involved in their treatment. The Family Feud application had been submitted by Quinn's older sister Maya, who had hoped that participating in a fun, engaging activity might help Quinn experience some spark of enjoyment or excitement that could break through their emotional numbness, even temporarily. She had also thought that the social interaction and novel experience might provide Quinn with positive stimulation that didn't depend on their ability to access deep emotional responses. During the pre-show preparations, Quinn had been cooperative and pleasant, but noticeably flat in their emotional responses to the excitement and novelty of television production. While other contestants were visibly nervous, excited, or energetic, Quinn had maintained the same steady, controlled demeanor that characterized their daily emotional state under medication. The game had been proceeding with Quinn participating competently, but without the enthusiasm or emotional investment that typically characterized contestants' engagement with the competition. The River family was competing against the Johnson family from Tennessee, and while both sides had been playing with energy, Quinn's emotional flatness had created a subtle but noticeable contrast with the animated responses of other family members. But when it came time for the category, the most difficult choice you've ever had to make, and it was Quinn's turn at the buzzer, the question had struck directly at the heart of their ongoing struggle with treatment decisions that involved fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, emotion, and what makes life worth living. Steve Harvey had approached the podium with his usual warm energy, but something about Quinn's controlled demeanor and the obvious concern of their family had made him more thoughtful and attentive than usual. "All right, Quinn," Steve had said gently, "the most difficult choice you've ever had to make, what comes to mind?" Quinn had looked at Steve with the steady, somewhat distant gaze that characterized their medicated emotional state, then responded with the clinical precision that had become their way of discussing profoundly personal experiences. "Whether to feel suicidal or feel nothing at all," Quinn had said, their words immediately creating shock and concern among everyone present. "My antidepressants work. I'm not suicidal anymore, but they've also taken away every other feeling I used to have. I don't feel happy, sad, excited, or afraid. I'm just existing." The studio had become completely quiet as everyone present understood that they were witnessing someone describing one of the most difficult paradoxes of psychiatric treatment, the way that life-saving interventions can fundamentally alter the experience of being alive. Steve had paused, clearly moved by the complexity and difficulty of Quinn's situation. "Quinn," Steve had said with obvious respect, "that's an impossible choice that no one should have to make. How do you handle living with that kind of decision?" I try to remember that staying alive was the right choice, even if it doesn't feel like living, Quinn had explained with the philosophical acceptance that had come from extensive therapy and reflection. I know intellectually that my life has value and that the people around me care about me, even though I can't feel those things emotionally anymore. The studio audience had listened with obvious emotion as they learned about a side effect of psychiatric treatment that challenged fundamental assumptions about mental health recovery and what it means to be well. "What do you want people to understand about this experience?" Steve had asked with genuine curiosity and concern. "That sometimes getting better means accepting that you might not feel better," Quinn had replied with remarkable clarity. "Mental health treatment isn't always about feeling happy. Sometimes it's just about not wanting to die." Steve had looked at Quinn's family, who were clearly emotional as they listened to their loved one articulate such a complex and difficult experience with such composure. "How has this affected your family's understanding of mental health?" Steve had asked with obvious compassion. "It's taught us that recovery isn't always what we expected it to look like," Maya had said through tears. "We're grateful Quinn is alive, but we also miss the person they were before, even though that person was in so much pain." Quinn's father had nodded, his voice filled with love and complexity. "It's made us realize that there are no perfect solutions," he had said. "We support Quinn's choice to prioritize safety over feeling, but we also hope that someday there might be better options." Steve had looked at Quinn with deep respect and understanding. "Quinn," Steve had said, "what you're dealing with shows incredible wisdom and courage. You've made a choice to prioritize your survival, and that takes strength that most people couldn't imagine." Steve had begun removing his suit jacket, understanding that this moment required recognition of Quinn's extraordinary decision-making and the complexity of psychiatric treatment. "Quinn," Steve had said, placing the jacket around their shoulders, "this jacket represents something very important today. It represents the understanding that sometimes healing means finding balance between feeling and surviving, and that choosing life, even when life feels different than before, is an act of courage." Quinn had accepted the jacket with their characteristic controlled response, clearly moved despite their inability to access the full emotional impact of the moment. Steve had turned to address the studio audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve had announced, "Quinn River is showing us something profound about mental health treatment and the difficult choices that recovery sometimes requires. They're teaching us that getting better doesn't always mean feeling better, and that sometimes the greatest act of self-love is choosing survival over sensation." The game had resumed with increased understanding of the complexity of mental health treatment and the difficult trade-offs that psychiatric medications can require, as everyone recognized that they were witnessing someone whose survival had come at significant personal cost. When Steve had asked the final question about things worth fighting for, Quinn had answered, "The hope that someday feeling nothing won't be the only alternative to feeling too much." The episode aired 3 months later and became an important educational tool for understanding medication side effects and the complexity of psychiatric treatment decisions. Mental health organizations used Quinn's story to help people understand that recovery from mental illness can involve difficult trade-offs and that medication-induced emotional blunting is a real and challenging side effect that deserves recognition and support. Quinn had kept Steve's jacket as a symbol of the moment when their difficult choice was recognized and validated rather than minimized or misunderstood. More importantly, their story had helped connect them with other people experiencing similar medication side effects and had contributed to advocacy efforts for more research into treatments that could preserve mood stability without eliminating emotional range. The jacket represented Quinn's understanding that choosing survival was valuable even when it meant sacrificing other aspects of human experience, that mental health treatment was complex and imperfect, and that their decision to prioritize safety over sensation was worthy of respect and understanding. Because that's what wisdom looks like when it faces impossible choices between pain and numbness. That's what courage sounds like when it chooses survival over sensation. And that's what happens when a 19-year-old person teaches everyone around them that mental health recovery is more complex than simply feeling better, and that sometimes the greatest act of self-preservation is accepting that healing might change who you are in fundamental ways. Quinn River had traded their emotional range for their life, but on that day at Family Feud, they showed that survival itself was valuable, that difficult treatment decisions deserved understanding rather than judgment, and that hope for better solutions could coexist with acceptance of current limitations in mental health care.